a story of power, silence, and one woman's relentless pursuit of truth. When a high-ranking federal prosecutor stood up against a judge once considered untouchable, the system trembled. The cameras were already rolling when Pam Bondi stepped up to the podium in Tallahassee, her presence as controlled and deliberate as the silence that preceded her first words. No notes, no teleprompter, just a single manila folder resting on the podium, and her eyes fixed on the sea of reporters, their lenses aimed and ready. "This isn't political," she began, her voice calm, unwavering. "This is about trust, and Judge Malcolm Greer has broken it." For a moment the room didn't move. Then the murmurs began, confused, electrified. Within minutes her words were reverberating across national networks, appearing on tickers beneath stunned anchors struggling to recalibrate mid-broadcasts. Pam Bondi, the nation's highest-ranking federal prosecutor, had just named a sitting federal judge, Malcolm Greer, as the subject of a criminal investigation. It was the kind of statement that didn't just shift narratives, it detonated them. Greer, known for his pristine academic pedigree and quiet influence in cases involving national security, had long been seen as untouchable. His courtroom decisions rarely questioned, his authority rarely challenged. Until now, Bondi offered no elaborate speech, no theatrics. She didn't need them. The mere existence of the sealed documents she held, the weight of what was about to unfold, was enough. She paused only once to let the gravity settle in the room, then closed the folder and stepped away. Reporters fired questions the moment she left the podium. Microphones stretched, voices overlapped, chaos surged. But she didn't answer. She didn't look back. She simply walked out, heels echoing against the marble floor, leaving behind a silence more deafening than any statement. Within the hour, media outlets began digging into Judge Greer's history, rulings, political ties, unusual case assignments. Cable news anchors stumbled to find experts who could explain the legal ramifications of a federal judge under investigation by the Department of Justice. Across law firms and federal agencies, inboxes pinged with internal memos. What do we know about Greer? Has he handled any of our cases? Legal analysts warned of chaos. Political pundits speculated on fallout. But in the eye of the storm, Bondi remained composed. What she'd just done wasn't a leak, a rumor, or a press stunt. It was a declaration. And it wasn't just aimed at one man in a robe, it was aimed at a system that had grown too comfortable with its own immunity. For Bondi, this wasn't the beginning of a political firestorm. It was the beginning of a reckoning. 2 days before the world heard Pam Bondi's voice echo through every major news network, the storm was already gathering inside a nondescript conference room on the 5th floor of the Justice Department headquarters in Austin, Texas. The walls were bare save for a muted seal of the DOJ, and a white noise generator humming just outside the door. A subtle reminder that what was said in this room was never meant to leave it casually. Bondi sat at the head of a long oak table, flanked by a tight circle of senior advisors. Alma Reyes, her deputy chief counsel and longtime confidant, leaned forward with a pen between her fingers but said nothing. A single slim folder lay at the center of the table, its contents innocuous in thickness but radioactive in implication. Inside were excerpts from decrypted signal messages, flagged judicial memos, and quiet interviews with former court staff, none of which had been leaked to the press. Not yet. "This doesn't go to oversight," Bondi said flatly, her eyes on no one in particular. "This goes to indictment." No one responded at first. The weight of her words needed a moment to settle. Months earlier, what started as a routine case audit triggered by an anonymous tip had evolved into something darker. What they were staring at now wasn't just a case of questionable ethics. It was a potential abuse of federal judicial power. At the center of it all, Judge Malcolm Greer, whose name kept appearing in connection with sealed hearings, inexplicable scheduling shifts, and unusually delayed rulings, particularly in cases tied to immigration enforcement and encrypted communications. Rosa Alvarez, a former clerk under Greer, had reached out quietly, disclosing a troubling pattern: last-minute reassignments, vanished court records, and rulings issued verbally but never documented. Bondi's team had followed the threads, and what they found behind them wasn't just smoke, it was the outline of something combustible. Avi Shah, the DOJ's cyber forensics lead, had managed to retrieve partial logs from Signalgate, a messaging scandal initially dismissed by the media as conspiracy fodder. But the logs painted a clearer picture. Judge Greer was not only aware of politically sensitive cases involving former administration officials, but he had been communicating with several of them through unofficial channels in the months leading up to key rulings. One message stood out. Vague, but suggestive. "I've got it covered on our end." The date placed it just 2 weeks before Greer quietly sealed the pretrial schedule on a lawsuit involving Signal itself. Still, Bondi had held off going public. Not because she lacked proof, but because she needed timing. She didn't want a leak. She wanted a seismic shift. Her team cross-referenced rulings, verified whistleblower statements, secured subpoenas. They weren't just building a case, they were constructing a reckoning. And now, the folder in the center of the table was no longer a question. It was a fuse. "We move forward," Bondi said, standing, "and we don't flinch." No one argued. They all knew. Once the next step was taken, there'd be no way back. It happened on a quiet Friday evening, the kind of late-hour lull when most of the city had already checked out for the weekend. But inside a federal courtroom in San Antonio, something far from routine was unfolding. Judge Malcolm Greer, known for his restrained demeanor and preference for closed-door sessions, issued a verbal restraining order halting the deportation of 6 foreign nationals suspected of being connected to La Sombra Roja, a notoriously violent cartel operating along the Texas-Mexico border. The decision came suddenly, without written opinion, without posted documentation, and without any formal court filing for federal agencies to act upon. The Department of Homeland Security was blindsided. "We have no paperwork," read an internal email from a field operations director. "How do we ground planes based on a hallway comment?" But that's exactly what had happened. Greer delivered the order off the record, just moments before leaving the courthouse. By the next morning, flights were in motion, agents were confused, and by Sunday DHS had moved forward with the deportations, citing the absence of a legal document to enforce. Then came the backlash. Greer, returning to the bench Monday morning, accused Homeland Security of defying a standing court order and signaled possible contempt proceedings. But legal analysts across the spectrum quickly pointed out the gaping procedural issue. There was no enforceable record. No filing, no timestamp, no public transcript, just a verbal directive given under questionable circumstances in a case with serious national security implications. For Pam Bondi, this wasn't just a bad call, it was calculated. She had already been monitoring Greer's rulings for months, tracking anomalies, irregular hearing schedules, and off-the-record decisions. But this wasn't legal ambiguity, it was judicial sabotage. The timing was too convenient, the lack of documentation too deliberate, and the consequences too real. The suspects involved were believed to have links to violent operations that had already left American agents dead or wounded. Inside Bondi's office, the shift was immediate. The mood turned cold, urgent. This wasn't the slow churn of bureaucracy anymore. This was a flashpoint. The verbal, only restraining order, delivered with zero transparency and maximum consequence, wasn't just irregular, it was incendiary. It signaled, in Bondi's eyes, not impartial judgment but protection, an intentional move to shield specific individuals without legal accountability. The line had been crossed. Her investigation, until that point kept quiet, now had a clear direction. The moment had come. Now it was war. What began as scattered inconsistencies soon unraveled into a disturbing pattern. After the Friday night ruling, Bondi's team intensified their investigation, pulling every file tied to Judge Malcolm Greer's past decade on the bench. What they discovered wasn't just one bad call, it was a blueprint. Over the span of several months, they uncovered a network of subtle manipulations buried in Greer's docket. Hearings quietly rescheduled without notice, clerks rotated off sensitive cases, and a trail of sealed documents that no one could account for. Rosa Alvarez, Greer's former clerk, became a key voice. In a confidential interview, she recalled an instance where a sealed motion vanished from the digital case log just hours before it was supposed to be reviewed. It wasn't just procedural oddities, she said. It was like someone was rewriting the rules in real time. Her testimony corroborated whispers that had long lingered in legal corners. Greer didn't just rule from the bench, he curated outcomes behind the scenes. Avi Shah, the DOJ's cyber forensics lead, began cross-referencing encrypted communications sourced from a long-dormant Signalgate investigation. The app, widely used during the prior administration for security purposes, had been at the center of a small watchdog lawsuit alleging misuse by high-ranking federal officials. That lawsuit, by pure coincidence or quiet design, had landed in Greer's courtroom. His response? Immediate closure of the hearings to the public, sealed witness lists, and indefinite delays in discovery. But Shah's recovered logs told a different story. Buried in encrypted exchanges was a message sent from a former DOJ advisor to Greer weeks before a critical motion was suppressed. JB says we'll bury it in pretrial, no panic, no files go public unless forced. The initials could have meant anyone, but paired with other emails, scheduling anomalies, and clerk notes, the implications narrowed quickly. Bondi's team also identified several rulings where Greer had failed to disclose potential conflicts of interest, particularly involving defendants who had worked with or consulted for national security contractors Greer had ties to during his years on the Foreign Intelligence Tribunal. The cases were often quiet, technically sound on paper, but always ended in dismissals, continuances, or indefinite sealing. In isolation, they looked like cautious jurisprudence, but together, they began to look like cover. The deeper Bondi's team dug, the more the evidence began to coalesce. Encrypted logs referenced courtroom timing adjustments. DOJ internal emails hinted at case files that mysteriously disappeared. Sealed dockets were linked to surveillance programs previously flagged for oversight abuse. This isn't rogue behavior, Almo Reyes said during a late-night strategy meeting. This is systemic. Bondi didn't disagree. She saw clearly what the pattern revealed. The judge who once stood as a model of quiet legal authority had become, in her eyes, a hidden operator, manipulating law through procedure, not principle. The case against Greer was no longer just credible, it was formidable, and it was gaining momentum. The case had always been personal to Pam Bondi in the abstract sense, about principle, law, and the invisible architecture of justice, but it became something else entirely the day the letter arrived. It was unmarked, handwritten, and slid quietly into her office mail stack in Austin. The return address read Corpus Christi, Texas. Inside was a single page, written in the slanted, shaky cursive of a mother whose life had been fractured by a decision she couldn't appeal. Her son, a Border Patrol agent, had been critically injured during a nighttime operation involving two men with suspected cartel ties, men who had slipped through immigration processing due to a restraining order signed weeks earlier by Judge Malcolm Greer. "My son can't walk anymore," the letter read. "His spine is broken, and the man responsible is living free because of a courtroom decision we never got to see. We can't keep pretending this isn't connected." Bondi read the letter twice. Then a third time. She folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of her desk, not out of sentiment, but out of resolve. That letter gave weight to everything her team had uncovered. It wasn't just about procedural misconduct or judicial overreach. It was about real-world consequences, about lives altered, families shattered, and the thin line between integrity and negligence. Critics would later accuse her of making the case against Greer personal. They weren't wrong, but it wasn't about ego or vengeance. It was about duty. Because when justice hides behind redactions and robes, someone has to bring it back into the light. For Bondi, that letter wasn't just fuel. It was the final push. The system might be afraid to hold one of its own accountable, but she wasn't. By the time Pam Bondi returned to the podium in Tallahassee, the press room was at capacity. Journalists shoulder to shoulder, cables snaking across the floor, microphones clustered like a bouquet of steel. But this time, Bondi didn't come alone. Flanking her were two senior DOJ investigators and Alma Reyes, her deputy counsel, stone-faced and silent. The air buzzed with anticipation, but Bondi's demeanor was unchanged, measured, composed, utterly unmoved by the flashing lights or clicking shutters. She opened a slim folder and began to speak. No theatrics, no inflammatory rhetoric, just facts. The Department of Justice is formally pursuing charges against Judge Malcolm Greer, she said, her voice steady. These charges include obstruction of justice, misuse of judicial authority, and willful concealment of evidence. The room erupted, but Bondi didn't raise her voice. She simply continued, detailing a pattern of rulings, omissions, and sealed case actions that deviated from established legal norms, particularly in high-stakes national security and immigration cases. She outlined, in clinical terms, how Judge Greer had systematically shielded sensitive cases from scrutiny, suppressed evidence, and potentially manipulated court processes to benefit political and personal allies. This is not about policy differences or partisan disputes, she said. This is about the fundamental integrity of our judicial system. Across the country, cable networks cut into programming mid-sentence. Legal analysts scrambled to contextualize what was unfolding. A sitting federal judge, one with decades of service and deep institutional ties, was being indicted not by a congressional committee, not by partisan actors, but by the Department of Justice itself, Bondi's own office. Critics immediately fired back, accusing her of weaponizing her authority. Commentators on legacy news channels framed it as a dangerous escalation, an attack on judicial independence. But the story had already taken hold. Supporters flooded online forums and social media feeds, hailing her as the one official brave enough to confront corruption from within the system. Hashtags trended. Protesters gathered in front of federal courthouses. Inside legal circles, the shock was palpable. Clerks, attorneys, even judges exchanging quiet messages that all began the same way. Is this real? Pam Bondi didn't stay for questions. She knew her presence wasn't the story. What she'd just set in motion was. For the first time in a generation, the judiciary itself was on the defensive. And for Bondi, that wasn't a crisis. It was the necessary start of something long overdue. While the headlines focused on the historic indictment behind the closed doors of the DOJ's Austin headquarters, the real story was just beginning to take shape. Pam Bondi and her team were no longer just tracking judicial irregularities. They were unraveling an ecosystem of secrecy centered around a messaging scandal the media had once dismissed as a legal footnote. Signalgate. Initially framed as a dispute over transparency and digital communication tools, Signalgate took on a darker shape when Avi Shah's cybersecurity unit began decoding fragments of encrypted conversations between legal staffers, administration officials, and, most critically, Judge Malcolm Greer himself. What emerged wasn't just a chain of informal conversations. It was a digital map of coordination, concealment, and calculated delay. The messages weren't explicit, but their patterns were damning. Cryptic references to court calendars, warnings about optics, and repeated mentions of stalling discovery to let the heat cool. The most alarming revelation came from a reconstructed conversation between a legal assistant connected to a surveillance lawsuit and a former DOJ staffer. One message stood out, stark in its simplicity. JB says, "We'll bury it in pre-trial. No panic, no files go public unless forced." While initials could be argued, the surrounding metadata and timing placed Greer squarely in the line of implication. Bondi's team was methodical. They cross-referenced timestamps with courtroom logs, subpoenaed access records, and matched internal clerk shifts to sealed case adjustments. One memo, buried in an archived case file, revealed an unpublicized rescheduling order that aligned perfectly with a signal message referencing the need to buy time. More troubling still were the judge's decisions to hold sensitive hearings in closed chambers under the guise of national security, often without formal justification. Witnesses were sworn in behind locked doors, transcripts heavily redacted or never produced. Bondi believed these were more than just procedural preferences. They were intentional barriers to transparency. As internal momentum built, external pressure intensified. Rumors began circulating that Signalgate implicated individuals far beyond Judge Greer. Former national security advisors, legal consultants tied to defense contractors, even a former deputy attorney general. Every new message seemed to pull another thread, and each thread led back to one courtroom. Bondi's investigators found clear evidence of case steering, notes that read, "Too hot for another judge," and emails that suggested Greer had pre-selected cases he felt could be managed without public fallout. None of it was direct proof of criminal conspiracy, but in context, it painted a chilling picture of a legal system quietly edited from within. Pam Bondi knew she couldn't release everything, but what they had gathered was enough. In coordination with legal counsel, she cleared a subset of messages for public disclosure, enough to reveal the architecture of manipulation without jeopardizing national security. The moment those documents hit the public docket, the narrative shifted. Signalgate was no longer a speculative scandal, it was a reckoning in motion. And Malcolm Greer, once a faceless figure behind the bench, now stood as the symbol of a broken trust. The courthouse in San Antonio had never seen anything like it. Streets outside were blocked off, lined with media vans, protesters and counter-protesters holding signs that read everything from "Justice for Greer" to "No more shadow courts." Inside, the marble halls that once echoed with reverence were now charged with anticipation. The building itself seemed tense, as if the walls understood the gravity of the moment. For the first time in his decades-long career, Judge Malcolm Greer wasn't presiding from the bench. He was entering through the side hallway, flanked by federal marshals and his legal team, not in robes, but in a charcoal suit that seemed too crisp for the weight he now carried. He avoided eye contact, kept his shoulders square, but there was no mistaking the shift. He was no longer the man delivering rulings. He was the one being judged. The gallery was restricted, no cameras, limited press, and a media blackout on live recordings. But still, every word spoken inside would ripple across the country within hours. The presiding judge, flown in from a different circuit to avoid any conflicts of interest, kept the tone clinical. Charges were read out in crisp legal cadence: obstruction of justice, misuse of judicial authority, and failure to recuse in cases involving clear conflicts of interest. Greer pled not guilty to all charges, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere between the floor and the bench. There was no outburst, no drama, just an eerie stillness. An empire of legal tradition suddenly turned inward on itself. Outside, reaction was divided. Legal commentators debated whether Bondi had set a dangerous precedent or whether she had finally punctured a culture of unchecked judicial discretion. Some of Greer's former colleagues issued carefully worded statements defending his integrity. Others remained silent. Inside federal agencies, emails bearing Greer's name were quietly restricted, sealed, or scrubbed from open directories. And whispers of old cases being re-reviewed circulated quietly. The Justice Department released no further public comment, letting the indictment speak for itself. Pam Bondi did not appear at the arraignment. She had no need to. Her work, for now, was done. But for the public, the most shocking part wasn't the courtroom choreography. It was the fact that this was happening at all. A federal judge on trial. Not just in headlines, but in handcuffs of accountability. For years, the judiciary had seemed impervious, above the noise. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone behind the bench had to answer to it. The verdict came down on a muted spring evening, with no fanfare, no dramatic music, just the low murmur of people shifting in their seats and the faint scrape of a gavel striking wood. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was taut but restrained, exactly how the system preferred its scandals: orderly, procedural, contained. Judge Malcolm Greer sat at the defense table, his expression carved from stone, as the clerk read the decision: not guilty on the counts of obstruction of justice and failure to recuse. There simply wasn't enough preserved evidence to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. But two charges stuck: willful concealment of evidence and misuse of judicial authority. The courtroom held its breath as the sentence was handed down: removal from the federal bench, permanent disbarment, and a formal recommendation for federal review of all rulings made during his last 5 years on the bench. No jail time, no handcuffs, but also no return to power. His legacy, once ironclad, had shattered. There was no reaction from Greer, no visible shift in his expression. He sat still, eyes unfocused, like a man watching his own reflection crack. His attorneys offered brief, muted objections, but it was clear they had expected worse, and yet, somehow, this was heavier. Outside, the response split like lightning across the national psyche. Some viewed the sentence as too lenient, a symbolic gesture for someone who had manipulated the levers of justice in near silence for years. Social media exploded with frustration. No prison, just a desk clean-out? But others, particularly those within the legal community, saw the ruling as a seismic precedent. The unthinkable had become real. A federal judge had been held to account, not behind closed doors, not with quiet resignation, but publicly and formally, and in that there was power. Pam Bondi didn't hold a press conference. She didn't issue a victory statement. She returned to her office in Austin, closed the door, and looked out over the city as dusk crept across the skyline. "That's one," she whispered to no one in particular. Not a celebration, but a marker, a reminder. Because she knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't about Malcolm Greer alone. This was about every robe worn in silence, every ruling made in shadows, and every citizen who had wondered if anyone was truly watching the watchers. Now they knew. At least one person was. In the weeks following the verdict, the headlines gradually faded, but the impact did not. Judge Malcolm Greer quietly left San Antonio, his name stripped from directories, his office vacated without ceremony. But what he left behind was a system that could no longer pretend. Across the country, conversations began in places they hadn't before. Coffee shops, law school classrooms, veterans' halls, immigration offices. For the first time in years, ordinary Americans were reading court transcripts, watching hearings, and asking hard questions. Who else is making decisions in the dark? At the DOJ, an internal review system for judicial conduct was fast-tracked, quietly approved without press but with urgency. And Pam Bondi? She stayed out of the spotlight. No interviews, no victory laps. Her quote, "I'd rather lose my seat than lose my spine," was printed on bumper stickers and law school bulletin boards. Critics still called her reckless, but others called her something else, necessary. Because justice, it turned out, wasn't just about what happened in the courtroom. It was about who had the courage to enter it. And now, finally, someone was watching, not with outrage, with resolve. The story of Pam Bondi's pursuit of accountability against Judge Malcolm Greer reveals a powerful and unsettling truth. Even the institutions built to uphold justice are not immune to corruption when power is left unchecked. The lesson isn't just about one judge. It's about the quiet erosion of public trust when decisions are made behind sealed doors, when influence replaces integrity, and when no one is willing to speak out. Bondi's courage reminds us that real accountability doesn't come from headlines. It comes from persistence, sacrifice, and a refusal to look away. She didn't act for applause. She acted because justice, when manipulated, leaves real people broken, families harmed, truth buried, lives changed. Her actions showed that silence, especially from those in power, is complicity. And while holding someone like Greer accountable came at a personal cost, it reignited a national conversation about the role of the judiciary, the power of transparency, and the need for vigilance in even the most revered corners of government. In the end, the lesson is simple but urgent. The law must not only be enforced, but seen to be enforced. Because without accountability, there is no justice, and without justice, there is no trust.